253 stores, 50 years in business, the largest boating supply retailer in America, and in May 2026, it filed for bankruptcy anyway. Not because the boats stopped selling, they didn't. Not because the customers walked away, they didn't. West Marine drowned for a stranger reason. In 2017, a private equity firm had taken it private for just $388 million, and over the next 9 years, its debt was piled up to nearly $800 million at its peak, more than twice the purchase price, without the company ever earning the extra revenue to carry it. The boats still sold, the customers still came, the business worked, and it drowned anyway. So, this is not a story about a dying industry or a bad season on the water. It is a story about how you can take a profitable company, buy it, and then bury it under more debt than it could ever carry, and walk away before the weight comes down on someone else. Keep one number in the back of your mind, because we end on it. At the very end of this, the vendors who kept West Marine's shelves full were owed more than $65 million. They were offered $250,000 to split between them. We will get to who got the rest, but to understand how a company that worked ended up underwater, you have to start in that garage. In 1968, a man named Randy Repass started selling marine rope by mail order out of a garage in Sunnyvale, California. He called it West Coast Ropes. It was the kind of business built one knot at a time. Boaters who needed the right line, the right cleat, the right life jacket, and a person who actually knew which one. By the mid-1970s, there was a real store in Palo Alto. By the 1990s, West Marine was a publicly traded company on NASDAQ, and after swallowing its biggest rival, it became the largest marine specialty retailer in the country. This was not a fad. By 2017, West Marine ran 253 stores across more than 30 states and Puerto Rico, and brought in around $707 million a year. The margins were thin. This is retail, and boating is seasonal and weather-dependent, but the company made money, and it had something rarer than margin. It had loyalty. If you owned a boat, you knew West Marine the way an earlier generation knew their hardware store. Walk into one of those stores, and you understood the business in a second. Rope sold by the foot, walls of life jackets, charts and cleats and anchor lime, and behind the counter someone who had probably spent the weekend on the water themselves. It was not glamorous, and it did not need to be. People came back season after season because the company knew the one thing the internet still struggles with. A boat is expensive, the water is unforgiving, and you want the right part from someone who actually knows. That trust took 50 years to build. It would take less than a decade to spend. And that loyalty, that steady $700 million a year, is exactly what made it a target. Because the people who bought West Marine in 2017 did not see a boating company, they saw a balance sheet with room on it. The buyer was Monomoy Capital Partners, a private equity firm, and the deal they did has a name, a leveraged buyout. Now, this is the mechanism the entire story turns on, so let me make it plain, because it sounds like accounting and it is actually the whole trick. When you buy a house, you borrow the money, and you are the one who owes the mortgage. In a leveraged buyout, it works the other way around. The buyer borrows the money to make the purchase, but it is the company being bought that becomes responsible for paying it back. Imagine buying a house, and at the closing table the house itself signs for the loan. Monomoy paid $388 million for West Marine, and much of that money was raised as debt, then loaded directly onto West Marine's own books. The company, in effect, was handed the bill for its own sale. For a business with fat, predictable profits, that can be survivable. For a thin-margin retailer that depends on the weather and on people's spare cash for a hobby, it is a loaded gun pointed at the floor. The debt payments become a fixed cost that never sleeps, due in the good quarters and the bad ones alike. From the moment that deal closed, West Marine was no longer being run to grow. It was being run to service debt, and servicing that debt came first, before new stores, before raises for the crew, before the investment a retailer needs just to keep up. Every dollar that might have gone back into the business now had a prior claim sitting on top of it. A company that had spent 50 years answering to its customers suddenly answered to its lenders. That is the quiet violence of a leveraged buyout. Nothing looks different from the parking lot. The same flags are flying, the same crew is at the counter. But the priorities have been rewired from the inside. And the business is now working, first and foremost, for the people who financed its own purchase. And if it had stopped there, this might have been an ordinary story. But it didn't stop there. Because in 2021, a second, much larger firm arrived and did the one thing that should have been impossible. It made the debt bigger. That firm was Catterton, a private equity giant backed by the luxury empire LVMH. In 2021, it bought control of West Marine from Monomoy. The price was never disclosed. And that silence matters, because it tells you the first owners cashed out and walked, leaving the next owners and the company itself holding the leverage. Here is what a rescue would have looked like. Pay the debt down, give the company room to breathe. Here is what actually happened. Catterton brought in new financing, fresh loans from Barclays, Golub, and Nomura, and re-leveraged the company. They didn't lighten the load, they added to it. By late 2022, the ratings agency Moody's measured West Marine's debt at almost 18 times its earnings. To put that in perspective, a healthy retailer typically sits around 3. West Marine was carrying roughly 6 times that. So watch the two lines move in opposite directions, because this is the heart of it. The debt climbs, past the purchase price, toward $800 million. And the revenue? The revenue does not move at all. Around $700 million when Monomoy bought it. Around $700 million when Monomoy bought it. Around $700 million years later. 9 years of private equity ownership. 3 owners. At least 5 different chief executives cycling through the top job. And not $1 of real growth to show for it. The company wasn't being built. It was being borrowed against. Stop and sit with that for a second, because it is the whole case. A business does not normally die while its sales are holding steady. Something has to be pulling money out faster than the business can bring it in. And in just a few minutes, we will reach the moment the people running West Marine stood up and called what they were doing a rescue. And you will see exactly who that rescue was built to protect. It was not the crew. It was not the vendors who stocked the shelves. It was not you, the customer. And here is the detail that should make you sit forward. On April 13, 2026, just 5 weeks before the company filed for bankruptcy, its own board quietly established a special committee, independent directors, handed binding authority to investigate potential claims against the company's own insiders, not a regulator, not the government, the company's own board, turning to look at the people who had been running it. They had already decided that something had happened. The only questions left were what, and to whom, and whether anyone was going to say it out loud. And a balance sheet like that has a gravity of its own. Once the debt is that much bigger than the business, every bad quarter pulls harder than the last. By 2023, West Marine was running out of air, and what came next was sold to the public as a save. It was anything but. In 2023, there were 2 out-of-court restructurings, deals done quietly with the lenders away from a courtroom. On paper, they looked like generosity. Lenders agreed to wipe out around $660 million of debt, converting it into ownership. Al Catterton put in roughly $83 million of fresh capital, and in exchange took about 1/3 of the new company and kept control. 1/3 of the company for $83 million, while the people it owed money to ate the losses. But the part that should make you stop is what they did with the debt that remained. The replacement loan, about $137 million at first, came with something called a PIK option. PIK stands for Payment in Kind, and it is exactly what it sounds like. Instead of paying interest in cash, the company is allowed to pay it by piling more debt onto the loan. The balance grows by itself. It is debt that compounds in the dark, that gets bigger every quarter even if not a single customer walks through the door. At the rates on that loan, the balance compounded at double digits a year. By the time West Marine reached bankruptcy, that $107 million loan had swollen to roughly $251 million, consistent with the pay-in-kind terms on that loan compounding over those years. The rescue had quietly grown the very debt it claimed to fix. This is the part that should retire the word restructuring from the headlines. Nothing was restructured in the way that matters. The company did not come out lighter or safer or freer to invest in itself. It came out with a smaller headline number and a meaner loan, controlled by the same sponsor, on a slow march back to the same courtroom. A restructuring that fixes nothing is not a rescue. It is a delay, with fees attached. Even the ratings agency that upgraded the company after the restructuring wouldn't pretend. S&P raised its grade, and in the same breath warned that the capital structure was, in its own words, potentially unsustainable. That was 2023. They were proven right in under 3 years. Which brings us, finally, to the receipt. On May 17, 2026, West Marine filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in Delaware, owing about $549 million. With around 200 stores and roughly 2,600 employees, the people the company calls its crew. The signature on the filing belonged to Paul Day, brought in as chief executive barely 6 months earlier. The latest in a long line of leaders cycled through the top job while the debt kept climbing underneath them. And the filing was not a surprise to the people who mattered. It had been pre-negotiated. The sponsors and the lenders had agreed on the plan among themselves before the crew, the vendors, or the public knew it was coming. By the time it became official, the outcome was already written. And remember that special committee the board had quietly created 5 weeks earlier? The one investigating its own insiders? Here is part of what there was to find. In the days before the filing, the company paid retention bonuses to insiders. The exact amounts were never made public, paid before the bankruptcy, so no judge had to approve them. The money went out the door first. The investigation came after. Think about what that sequence actually means. The people who controlled the company decided among themselves how the failure would be divided, and they did it before the crew or the vendors had a seat at the table. By the time the rest of the world learned West Marine was in real trouble, the trouble had already been carved up. The losses had names assigned to them. And the names at the top of that list were never going to be the ones who had signed the deals. Now read the receipt out loud. Who got paid? The private equity firms who bought and reloaded the company, who took their returns at each sale and left the debt behind. The lenders who collected double-digit interest on the way down. The restructuring lawyers and the financial advisors whose fees come off the top of the estate before anyone else sees a cent. And the insiders who collected their bonuses on the way out the door. And who got crushed? The crew members facing store closures, and the vendors, the marine supply companies who shipped product to West Marine on trust and kept those shelves full. Garmin alone was owed more than $8 million. Altogether, the unsecured vendors were owed more than $65 million, and the bankruptcy plan offered them a single shared pool of $250,000 to split among all of them. That is a recovery of under 1%, less than half a cent on the dollar. For keeping the company alive, that is the anatomy of this collapse, and there is nothing nautical about it. West Marine was not sunk by the sea, or by a bad economy, or by a generation that stopped buying boats. The boats still sold. The customers still came. The store still came. It was sunk by its own balance sheet, by a decade of being bought and reloaded and rescued, each time by people who made sure their own money came off the top first. A company born in the garage, carried for 50 years by the people who loved it, was turned into a machine for moving debt, and when the machine finally broke, the ones who built it were already on dry land, and the crew and the vendors were the ones left to drown.